I'm going to offer a point of view. That's really what this is. What you do with that point of view is entirely up to you. And how you use that information is your decision. And typically what I like to do is I like to stick needles in things. If the world is thinking in one direction, I really like to take an opportunity to try to think of the world differently. Because sometimes we get really stuck in the prevailing wisdom. Everybody starts thinking, we call it hive brain. Everybody's thinking the same way, and because we're all thinking the same way, that must be true. Well, there was a time in our history when everybody on the planet thought the world was flat, but they were all wrong. So what I like to do is look at what evidence is available about a certain topic, try to understand some of the things that are being presented or proposed with that evidence, and then just get people thinking about it a little bit. So that's really what we're going to do. And since core training is so hot right now, I put a question mark after it. And this is actually my own personal journey through this particular topic that I want to share with you. And it all started, not with that. It all started with that. Yes, I'm a Mets fan. Okay, so when this started was actually in during spring training. And I live in Boston now, or outside of Boston, and I always read the New York papers. And during spring training this year, I noticed that all these guys on the Mets were going on the disabled list with abdominal injuries. Did anybody notice that this year? Like there were an unusual number of people that were going on the DL with oblique injuries? Just the Mets, right? Not on the Yankees. So, I was thinking about this. Like, why at this current time, when everything is so focused on core training, how come there are these oblique injuries? Is it that it's just a topic that everybody's aware of right now, so if somebody gets injured, it kind of makes headline news, whereas maybe 10 years ago, we didn't care about it so much, so if somebody had that kind of injury, it wasn't reported? I mean, what is it that's causing these oblique injuries? And just about the same time that I was pondering this study came across my desk. It's called Abdominal Muscle Strains in Professional Baseball from 1991 to 2010. And it was Stan Conti. Stan Conti works at the Hospital for Special Surgery. So he's a physical therapist down there. Anybody know him? What's that? No, that's a different Conti. He wouldn't be publishing in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. Okay, so I'm thinking, all right, this is a blip on the radar. And so I looked at this study, and this is what I found. Am I in your way? That's what I saw. Now this is not a chart or a graph from his paper. I just took his data and transposed those data into this figure. So 1991 is all the way down here, and 2010 is over here, and this is kind of what you see over this 20-year span. Now it goes up, it goes down, it goes up. I mean, obviously this is not a straight line, but if you take a statistical curve, and if you do an average projection or a trend line statistically over this 20-year period, you see that. Now, I have to think about this. We are doing so much core training now. Everything is core. All you hear about is core. I'm sick of hearing about core. I mean, this is all we're doing is training the core. And if we're doing that, wouldn't it then make sense that this line should be declining if we're so focused on the core? How is it that this is getting progressively worse. So now I took these data and I broke them down into 5-year blocks. So this was my own manipulation of his data table. I took every 5 years and I took the average number of core injuries that occur over those 5 years, and I looked at those, and this is what you see. So from 91 to 95, they averaged about 15, and from 96 to 2000, about 19, and 2001 to 2000, you see where I'm going with this. So every 5 years, you're seeing more and more and more abdominal injuries in professional baseball. In fact, it's a 60% increase over the last 20 years that people are getting hurt. Why? That's the question that I have to ask. Why? If we're so focused on core strengthening, then why is this happening? What's wrong with this picture? I don't know the answer just yet. So this is my journey now through this. I have to figure out what's going on. So the first thing that I need to do is I have to ask the question, and this is the way my brain works. Step one, what is the core? Or more importantly, where is the core? And it gets kind of interesting when you start looking at how people define the core. So Declan, this is where I'm going to need some help from you, okay? Okay. According to, let me see if I can get this thing up here where it's supposed to be. All right, so there are several studies that go from 1981 to 2004 that basically define the core as the rectus abdominis, the external and internal obliques, the paraspinals, and the quadratus lumborum. Okay, so Declan, I need you to, I don't know what I did. Okay, just click on that for me. There you go. So this is one definition of core, which is, I think, the traditional definition. Click on that again, same one. Okay, so if you look at works by Schinkel and Hibbs, they call it a double-walled cylinder, including the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. And go ahead, Declan. And so now you see this, and this would also include the transverse abdominis. So it's all in that double-walled cylinder area. All right, Declan. Now, according to Conti, who just wrote our paper, it's the thoracolumbar, abdominal, pelvic, and hip. So now we've got all the hip musculature in here. So the core has gone from around the spine, and now it's migrating down into the hip area. All right, click on that again if you would. And now, according to Fig, the core also includes all the musculature between the sternum and the knees. So now that's the core. You can click on that, please. And according to Sharrock, Sharrock is a review article, and he says that the core should include the muscles of the shoulder. So that's the core. In other words, if you think about the muscles of the shoulder, too, those of you who have studied anatomy along with me, that includes the biceps and the triceps, too. Those are shoulder muscles, right? So the core now includes everything from your elbows to your knees. Well, you know, if you follow Gary Gray, who's telling you that it's one long kinetic chain, then why don't we just say that the core is everything from the feet to the head? That's the core. Because that's where people are going with this. The truth is, I'm not sure where these different models emerge from. I can tell you that from what I understand, the initial definitions of the core really come from spine rehab. When we talk about core stability, when someone has a low back injury, ruptured disc, herniated disc, that's where the original core stability concept came from. So that was all about rehabbing the spine. But now, a lot of these latter definitions, and something obviously that's including all of this, comes from the notion that the core is necessary to transfer power. That's really what it's talking about now. It's we need to be able to transfer power from the lower extremities to the upper extremities, and it's through the core that this transference of power occurs. And if we don't have a strong core, we can't transfer power. So that's where we get this definition that's really involving basically the entire body. I don't know that we can call the entire body the core any longer, but that's what people are doing, and we'll have to see how that plays out in some of the research that we're going to look at. So Declan, hit that if you would. Thank you. Okay. So now that we know where it is, I think, the question that we have to ask is, how is core blank measured? Now, I use this blank here because there are a lot of different ways that we refer to core whatever. It could be core strength, it could be core stability, it could be core function, it could be core endurance. These are all different terms that are used almost interchangeably in the literature, and they all have subtly different meanings, or they're used synonymously, and we don't even know they're being used synonymously. So that's why I leave this blank, because we first have to define what it is we're measuring before we can figure out what those measurements are trying to tell us. So generally speaking, core blank is defined as either stability or strength. That's what the literature tells us. Now, core stability is muscular control required around the lumbar spine to maintain functional stability. Stability really means preventing motion. That's what stability means. If you're trying to stabilize something, you're trying to keep it from moving. So the notion of core stability is to prevent unwanted motion in and around the spine. I think that's a fair definition. Strength is the ability of the musculature to produce force through contractile forces and intra-abdominal pressure. In other words, it's the ability to apply force. That's strength. Now, this gets a little bit tricky because you can have stability around a structure and not be able to apply force. And we'll talk about that a little bit in detail in a few minutes. But you keep this in mind. Just because a structure is stable doesn't mean that you have the capacity to apply force through that structure. Those are two completely different things. Then there's another definition here. The ability to control the position and motion of the trunk over the pelvis to allow optimum production, transfer, and control of force and motion to the terminal segment. I don't even know what that says. Basically, we need to control our upper body so that we can use our limbs. That's essentially what that means. And this definition sort of transcends stability and strength, because it's suggesting that we have to be stable enough to prevent unwanted motion so that when we're trying to apply force, we're not moving in a way that we don't want to move. That makes sense. Okay, I can live with that definition. But when we start looking at strength, how are we measuring strength? There are lots of different ways that we can measure strength. So, for example, are we really talking about strength, or are we talking about endurance? Because those are completely different things. If I did a 1RM on a sit-up, I probably am measuring strength. But if I ask you to do as many sit-ups as you can in 2 minutes, is that really a measure of strength, or is that a measure of endurance? It's a measure of endurance. Well, what if I asked you to do a plank for as long as you could do it? Is that a measure of strength or endurance? It's a measure of endurance, right? But is that static or dynamic? If I have you do a plank for as long as you can, is that a static measure of endurance or a dynamic measure of endurance? Because those are that's static, right? But those are two completely different things, aren't they? If I try to hold the plank position for as long as possible, or I try to do as many sit-ups as I can in a certain period of time, am I measuring the same thing? But no one actually clarifies that definition. And let me state that again. No one clarifies that definition. Nobody. By the way, we've been researching this at the Institute now for the last 6 months. We've got a stack of papers that we're reading through. Nobody clarifies this definition. No one. This is a little bit perplexing because we think we're measuring something and we have no idea what we're measuring, which is scary. So here are the questions. Are you really measuring strength or are you measuring endurance? If you're measuring strength or endurance, is it static or is it dynamic? Because those are completely different things. And they're going to tell you something different each time you try to go through that measurement. So here are some assessments that are typical things that we found in the literature. U.S. Military Academy, sit-up test. It's a sit-up test. How many sit-ups can you do in 2 minutes? I actually wish we haven't abandoned this. I think this is what we're missing. But I'll get back to that in a minute. So this is like the original abdominal assessment. How many sit-ups can you do? That is probably an endurance measure, but it's dynamic, right? It's a dynamic endurance measure. Then there are these tests that were developed by Stu McGill. Now, Stu McGill is a very well-known scientist, PhD. He's done a lot of research. What kind of measures are these? These are static endurance measures. He's also a proponent of only doing static type of core work. That's one of the things that he's been discussing recently is get away from the dynamic stuff, create static contractions around the spine, and that's your key to good health around the spine. I will say before I get into some of the research that I'm going to show you that when you're dealing with low back patients, that's probably true. But if you're going to take that concept and apply it to normal healthy people in dynamic activities, that's probably not a good thing to do. This is a test that was developed by a person named Cowley. This is a ballistic medicine ball throw. Pretty interesting. So you start in this position here with a medicine ball above your head. Notice her feet aren't anchored. And then what she's got to do is very rapidly go into a sit-up position and then release the ball over her head. And the measure is actually how far the ball goes. So this measure is how long can you maintain that position. So these are time tests. This is a repetition test. This is a measure of how far that ball flies. The farther the ball goes, the more power you're developing. So that is a real dynamic power assessment or strength assessment. The Sarman test. Most of you people are familiar with this. This is the one where you put your blood pressure cuff in the lumbar spine. You have 4 different positions with the leg, and you're looking to see at what point you start to lose pressure in the cuff, right? You're trying to hold the pressure in the cuff. So it's kind of a quasi-strength endurance something, all right? It's repeatable, which is kind of interesting. It's actually, this test has been studied several times in terms of its reliability, how repeatable it is, and it actually it proves as a fairly reliable test. The question is, what is it actually measuring? And that's really ultimately what we're going to be getting at here. And then the last one, which I thought was interesting, and this is actually in the literature, the SBP-SCST, which is the Swiss ball prone stabilization core stability test.